excited to see everyone here on a Sunday, and I'm really honored that Raz was so willing to put this amazing panel together. I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. Just for those of you who haven't been here before, we are a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities. We have popular education and political education programming, cultural programming, and combinations of the two. Culture is a very important and essential part of our resistance, so this is an example of something that kind of blends the two worlds together. And Raz was just so willing to, he's going to be teaching a course, and this is the kickoff panel and performance, so I hope you all come to attend his course as well the next 3 Mondays, starting tomorrow from 6 to 8 here at the People's Forum. So with that, I know you're all here to see Raz, so I'm going to pass it off to him.
Thank you, Laird. Thanks, People's Forum. Good afternoon. Good to see you. Thanks very much for coming. And thanks to this great panel of people who are longtime teachers of mine through music and their efforts in pushing the music forward, writing about the music, performing the music, organizing. And I'm grateful. And so we're going to hear what they have to say about jazz and self-determination. And I will introduce each person and talk with them individually first for a few minutes, and then bring up the main premise of the discussion. Of course, it's all tied in. So thanks again. First, Mr. Greg Tate, longtime writer from the Village Voice magazine, musician, composer, leader of Burnt Sugar Orchestra, and professor. And Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis, Electric Miles Scholar. And thank you. Mr. J.D. Perrin, founder and member of the Black Artists Group of St. Louis, multi-instrumentalist and educator. Mr. Juma Sultan, percussionist, instrument maker, healer, master musician, bass player, documenter of culture. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bashem Chawe, great educator, teacher, radio host of Education at the Crossroads on Thursday evenings on WBAI at 8 o'clock p.m. Founding member of the East Cultural Organization. And Mr. Ahmed Abdullah, trumpeter, musician, composer, teacher, educator, founding spirit within Studio We, New York Musicians Festival, as well as Mr. Sultan, who I forgot to mention, New York Musicians Festival, New York Musicians Organization as well. And I do have some physical examples of some of the work that they did from the time period we're discussing that I will share at our midpoint. Thank you kindly. Jazz and self-determination. Mr. Sultan, that was what was the origins of the New York Musicians Festival, New York Musicians Organization? And maybe a little bit of your own history as a musician first, with the efforts that you mentioned to me before, further north with Artist Colony 212 and everything, and Gypsy Sun and Rainbows.
It's a wide subject, so let me just start with your first question. Your first question was in reference to the New York Musicians Organization.
Yes.
And so before I give you background history on other aspects, the New York Musicians Organization started in 1972, and it started here in New York City, and it was an offspring from musicians wanting to have control over their works, and also have performances and have their work shown, throughout most of us were community-based at that time, and we were looking at not only the mainstream, but we wanted to touch our communities. And we, as Abdullah, I think, still live in Brooklyn. There were people from Queens, Bronx, from all places and all genre of music. So it basically started in 1972. The Newport Festival moved from Rhode Island to New York. And out of their itinerary of the number of musicians they hired, there was just a small handful that was here in New York. And so if you weren't in the mainstream, if you weren't on the club list to play in the Village Gate and all the other places that were available, your talent wasn't prescribed. And what we found out was there was thousands of musicians here in New York who wanted an opportunity to play. And the word got out, and just basically through word of mouth, through the musicians who, we all hung out in those days, you know, the clubs, and we talked. So we decided to try to look in the past and look at what people had done in terms of self-determination. One of the most recent one was and obvious was the Newport Festival, where Mingus and Max Roach, they refused to play, and they organized a festival across the street, and that was an immediate frame of reference. And so we figured that we could do a festival. So we did. The musicians, we all basically played for free with donation services and promises from maybe the city to help us get a sound system and things around. But I believe we had approximately 32 locations, and we were playing 24 hours a day, and we attracted attention from the Newport Festival. So that's basically some of the background in that area.
Thank you. Mr. Ahmed, you were involved with that as well, right? New York Musicians Festival.
Absolutely. I was not organizing it. I was too young to do that at the time, but I was a participant as a musician. And the interesting thing about the New York Musicians Festival is that it came out of another effort that happened in the 1960s, the October Revolution in jazz that Bill Dixon organized along with Archie Sheps, Sun Ra, Cecil Taylor, I'm missing some names, Carla Bley, yeah, but so it's significant in terms of understanding the social relationship between the cultural movement that was going on at the time. And I don't think that you can really separate them, that there was an effort to move the music forward socially, culturally, spiritually, as there was an effort to move people forward. And those two things came together. So the October Revolution of 1964 was something that gave rise to the fact that musicians, artists needed to come together in some kind of way to form movements against what this society has really done, which was to keep art away from the people because it moves the people to think, and that is never something that the capitalist social realities of this country have been about. It's never been about getting people to move forward. So I was involved in it as an artist with a couple of groups. We performed at Studio Rifby, came out of that, and a number of other places that were considered part of the what I call the Loft movement. And I call it the Loft movement because of what Juma just stated. The musicians actually organized to protest the fact that George Wein was coming to New York and not really hiring musicians who were in New York, who were made up a large part of the musicians community. So it was an intentional thing, an organizing intention to get people together like that. Yeah.
And Studio We was a central focus of the festival, along with the other organizations. But that particular location seems to have played a a huge role in the musicians who were primarily organizing that effort. And as far as Studio We, the New York Musicians Festival, Studio We played a primary role within those efforts. Am I correct?
He had just mentioned the October Revolution. Well, even though Studio We played a primary part of it, the first meetings that happened around the New York Musician Festival happened at the same place where the October Revolution took place, which would be the University of the Streets. Nobody really acknowledged the number of places and the people who were involved, at that time. And in terms of musicians, when he brought in the October Revolution, Bill Dixon? Everybody. I mean, it was like one of those things where all the musicians would come there to play. There were just everybody that you know. I could name names like C Sharp and on and on and on and on. Just people who are really not known in the
Earl
mainstream.
Cross,
Well, Earl Cross also.
Monty Waters.
Well, no, during the October Revolution, those guys were in California.
Oh, early. I'm sorry.
Right,
I
I'm
was
sorry.
confused.
That's another story. Okay, okay. But Abdullah, you're familiar. So you have to readdress your question. Excuse me, which was.
Okay. Okay. The foundation, the same location that was the October Revolution was the initial formation of the idea for the New York Musicians Festival.
Well, it was the studio. I mean, University Streets was a place that Muhammad. He was a saxophone player.
Yes, sir.
He offered to musicians, but not only there. They had community. It was a very community-involved building right on 7th Avenue and B, and they had community projects. They had theater. They had artists. And as Abdullah indicated, that the movement that was happening then was cross-culture. I mean, it was shared by artists of all genres, from poets to painters, sculptors, whatever your art form was. And it was a integration in the community. I basically, at that time, was during that particular period, was on the Lower East Side. And as you mentioned, Studio We. Well, Studio We started out in 1968. Burton Green had a loft on the second floor of 193 Eldridge Street in Manhattan, right on the corner of Rivington. And he decided to move upstate to a music program where they were offering him a tenure, which was called Group 212, located in Saugerties, New York. And he gave the space to James Du Bois. And James Du Bois, a trumpet player from Pittsburgh, just wanted a place to play. I met James Du Bois probably in 1967, upstate New York. Sonny Simmons introduced me to him, and he was living upstate New York at that time. And but he started a program in 1968 called Music Through the Ears, where he ran a 3-day program of music around the clock for 3 days at that location. And that was the beginning of Studio We.
Thank you. Beautiful. Incidentally, the pictures that are serving as a backdrop for the discussion come from Mr. Sultan's archive from Studio We and the activity that happened over there, jumisarchive.org. And it seems like the changes in the music and the social changes with black people were parallel dynamics. People say free music, free playing. That was definitely side by side with an increasing sense of self-determination. I have to revise the phrase increasing sense because that always existed. But just technically in reference to social formations and community programs, and the jazz idiom always seemed to be a part of that, the artistic wing of that, with the same message. And I just wanted to thank the panel again because I had parents that frequented the East Cultural Center in the early 70s when I was a child, and I was there occasionally with them. And sometimes I wish I was older now that I actually play music myself, but I remember the energy and pretty much launched whatever's happening now. But in reference to that, Mr. J.D. Perrin was the embodiment of that that was happening in St. Louis with the Black Artists Group, which had the same intent. Professor Perrin, what led to the formation of the Black Artists Group of St. Louis?
Well, thank you, Ross. Well, obviously, St. Louis, Missouri is a different place than New York City. And there we were, you know, in the end of the, during the, and the backdrop of the force of the civil rights movement pushed people into self-awareness and, you know, of trying to be who you really were in the world and to organize around that. Well, some of the things that were so clear is that you couldn't get a job playing your own music in clubs, and you were demanded to play just standards. This was just one of the dynamics, since St. Louis is a small place, and the opportunities were somewhat small, you know, but the heritage of coming up and hearing bebop being played in the town, it can't be, I'm so grateful for it. You know, on Eastern Avenue, which, this is the background, the bag. Fat States Lounge, the Moonlight Bar where all the Chicago bluesmen played. Fat States Lounge where we used to go after band rehearsal on Saturday and hear guys playing bebop. Oliver Lake lived on that street right down the corner from that street, and we all grew up in this, had access to this milieu. I would go in the club and listen. I would on the artist Cokes. They didn't bother me about alcohol, because I wasn't trying to drink. I personally wasn't trying to drink alcohol. But the blues and jazz certainly was in the neighborhood and and it hit us in our soul. Now, this is a breaking point when the ACM started in Chicago. And for St. Louis, it was tremendous because particularly Oliver Lake and some of the others would go up there and visit and come back so excited about what they saw. The main thing that was seen was that blacks up there were doing for self. And this put a complete, you know, then it became a no-brainer. Promote your own concerts if somebody doesn't want to promote you. You know, it really happened that way. People were coming back from the war. People were coming back in the late 60s and early 70s. People like Vincent Terrell, Bruce Rudlin had moved up to Chicago and moved back down. Then Julius Hemphill moved to St. Louis, and that really turned it around. When Julius Hemphill moved to St. Louis, and it was the group was started. You know, Bobo Shaw, Bakita Carroll, Oliver Lake, Floyd LaFleur, Malinke Elliott, Malinke Bob Elliott, and others who formed the first committee to start BAG. And then Julius and Malinke were able to go out and raise money. It was a war on poverty time. You know, it didn't last long. You know, and we only had rent to pay for our building for 1 year. But during that time, there was a housing development right over in the neighborhood where my mama used to get her hair fixed and where my church was, it used to be called the Mill Creek area in St. Louis, but right where St. Louis U has taken over most of it in modern times. But this is where a housing place called Laclede Town was. And Oliver and his family lived there, the LaFleurs lived there, Bakita Carroll lived there, and the Lakes lived there, and several others in a low-rise housing community. And the church there, we made records there, you know, in that church. I made a record with Luther Thomas, you know, in that church there later on, a little bit later after this. But the first time I ever saw...
Funky Donkey. Was that the name of it?
Huh?
Funky Donkey.
Yeah, the Funky Donkey.
Yes, sir. Sorry. Thank you.
Scholar.
Yes, sir.
That's my scholar over there. Yeah, the Funky Donkey was made there. And I couldn't believe my mama came in that church with all that loud stuff coming, but you know how it is. They love you, when you're lucky. You have a mother that loves you. But the first time I ever heard two horns play without a rhythm section was in Laclede Town, and it was Hemphill and David Sanborn. And the people, and in my mind today, I knew the manager. He and I became very close later. Leroy Shelton, he was one of the bag actors. Vincent Terrell, one of the bag producer, performer, actor. This guy, he used to make a poster, and all of the different parts of the producer, he would give it all names, but he was doing it all. You know what I mean? He was a real creator. And I remember Jule was there with his little baby. Oliver was starting his family. He had only about 2 or 3 kids then, and it was just then came the money to rent the bag building. And I was one of the people that was interviewed by Catherine Dunham to teach in the bag school. So I got to teach we had, as I said, we had it that year. Thurman Falk, a filmmaker, was brought in by Catherine from New Yorker, and Emilio Cruz, the late Emilio Cruz came. And so we had that input as well. And so it was just the big bands. People started writing. I play in the big band. I played compositions by Oliver, by Julius, by Keita, by James Jabbo Ware, who I'm still playing with to this day. And we will play at the Baha'i Center in July, this July. We're still doing something. So I don't have time. I want to move on to hear somebody else.
Oh yeah, we're gonna do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we all gonna do it.
May I reiterate with
Sure.
some of the things? What he didn't mention was the multicultural aspect of BAG, which was very important, and it was very important because, as I said, that we drew on other things. And the ACM is the only organization of that nature that is still in progress, still in motion at this time. So I just thought that was important information to relate. Thank you.
Thank you. And I did not mention Sister's Place, which has been in existence and perpetuating what we're talking about now for many years through actual practice in the community. And thank you, and everything else. I'm sorry I didn't mention that at the beginning. And in reference to that, we had the East Cultural Center in Brooklyn, which was the embodiment, probably in its most integral way, in that it was located in the community, involved with education and art, and the synthesis of these two dynamics as not being separate from each other, and is a long-time source of inspiration. Now, as what happens with things, sometimes there's a certain percentage of it that's after the fact as far as recognition. And people, especially people into music, and especially the new music, the East has been a topic of conversation these days, thankfully. Because I know a lot of people, and the people in the community who raised me were always concerned about that. The fact that jazz in all its forms is right in the community. And I myself use that as an example periodically in discussions about the black community's supposed lack of understanding of the so-called new music or free jazz, et cetera, which maybe is a viewpoint that really came to fruition in the early 80s with that whole deluge of reactionary things. But of course, I don't remember things that way, and people like yourself who are the primaries know that it wasn't like that. So Professor Mchawe, in reference to the East Cultural Center and the music, how did that music program in particular develop in its origins?
All right, well, I think first what we have to do is put the East in some kind of political and social context. 1968 was a critical year for African people around the world for progressive people around the world. Numbers of things happened in 1968 which were important. April 4th, 1968, we have the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. At that particular point, people had to look at their ideological beliefs and try to reconcile what had happened to Dr. King with the idea of nonviolence. They had to look at the civil rights movement and see if, in fact, that was the direction that African people needed to move in, or did we have to move in another direction, one more in line with what Brother Malcolm talked about in terms of a struggle for human rights. 1968 also, around the world, there were uprisings and upheavals in schools around the world, not just a matter of in terms of the United States, but throughout Europe, parts of Africa, South America, the Caribbean. Young people in colleges and universities and high schools around the world were questioning what they were being taught, what was actually going on in their societies, and they were moving, they were doing something in regards to that. In New York, there was a major struggle in regards to what would happen as far as public education and the education of African people. There were a number of school districts, demonstration school districts, which were set up. And the idea in these districts, which were in part funded by the Ford Foundation, was the idea of community control, that people within their own communities, parents, educators, students, should be in control of their education. This kind of went on and culminated in a major struggle in 1968, in which there were a number of school strikes which paralyzed the school system in New York. What happened is, we have to say that the so-called education unions at the time, the leadership of those unions, they were not in favor of African people controlling their own destiny in terms of education. That the idea of, for instance, in a school district like Ocean Hill-Brownsville in Brooklyn, the idea that you would go ahead and move teachers from one school to another without the approval of the education union was something that they could not identify with. So there were a number of strikes. The union, UFT, went out on strike, tried to keep all their teachers out of the schools, in the communities. College students, parents, everybody came to try to keep our schools open. It was a major, major issue. At another point, when the UFT came back, the students and parents had a strike and decided that they were not going to go ahead and come back to these particular schools if they were going to be in control. So we had a number of things that happened, and finally, ultimately, the Department of Miseducation, the Board of Miseducation at the time, they determined that there had to be a compromise, and the compromise was only a sellout. When the sellout occurred, there were numbers of young people and educators who decided that it was time to leave that system. And in the spring and summer of 1969, they had been organizing from the fall of 1968 into the spring. They decided that they were going to do something totally different. These young people and some older people, led by Baba Jitu Wayusi, then Leslie R. Campbell, found a building on Claver Place that at that particular point had been an art gallery. It was not in good shape, I've got to say. It was called Studio O. Studio O. Remember Studio O? So they found this building, and from the spring into the fall and the winter, they began to clean that building up, do some quick renovations, do some things to go ahead and make that building into something that could serve as a center of operations, not only in terms of educationally, because the issue initially was education, but also in regards to culturally. And G2, in terms of his view, he always understood that it was not just enough to have an educational institution, that it had to be supported by culture, and that one of the greatest, of course, manifestations of our culture has been historically our music. So, December 31st, 1969 was the first concert at the East, 10 Claver Place. Leon Thomas and his voice echoing throughout 10 Claver Place. December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1969. And that's where the music started. Now, G2, of course, again, being a visionary, understood that if in fact we were going to have an educational institution, there needed to be some economics to support it. And that part of the economic base of the East became our weekend sets. And the weekend sets, which are now not legendary, they're mythological. And they're mythological because certain people were not allowed to go ahead and see what happened in these particular sets that we had. So as such, the mythology of the East is one that is important. This year, 2019 being the 50th year of the anniversary of the founding of the East, we're going to be doing a lot of different kinds of things. We have right here my good brother Onaje, right here, one of the Eastites, one of the folks who was holding it down. And I mean, there are a number of us who are still upright and attempting to try to move forward. And this year, we're going to have a number of activities that are going to mark the 50th anniversary of the East. The East went on not only in terms of the weekend sets, and I brought some photos which I'm going to pass around specifically from the East. I didn't get with the tech people here, but I guess there'll be another opportunity, and I'll get with the tech people so we can project some of those particular images so you can see for yourself. But it was not enough just to go ahead and do that.
Part three ahead. Part three ahead.
Part three ahead. The East, clear in terms of the vision is that if in fact you do things to serve the community, the people will come and they will support it. So it was important to build a number of different kinds of institutions. So we had Uhuru Sasa Shule, which became the largest independent black school of its kind in the nation. We had what we call the Evening School of Knowledge, where adults could come and actually go ahead and go to classes and workshops. We expanded, we had a bookstore called the Akiba Mkuu, which in Swahili meant head shop. So it was not, enough for you to go ahead and get high, which was the head shops of the day and what people were doing. It was the idea of bringing new ideas and information into your head. We had Kununuana, which was later the Uhuru Food Co-op, one of the first co-ops of its kind that talked about the idea of people eating healthy and sharing food and health resources. That was part of the East as well. We had a clothing store, Mavazi. I mean, there were just a number of institutions. We started catering, not only for ourselves in the community, but for a network of independent schools, which essentially spun off from Uhuru Sasa. So there were numbers of institutions with the idea that, number one, you can be as political and cultural as you want to be, but there's got to be an economic base. And very often in regards to our community, we find that that's where we end up being missing something. And we can't necessarily, in a society like this, we can't miss the money. We can't miss the economics. That's got to be part of what we do. But of course, in doing so, we always use the concept of ujamaa, which in translation itself means familyhood. But of course, people take it to be cooperative economics, and people like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, when he wrote about uhuru na ujamaa, the idea of freedom and economics as a basis, but a basis in terms of not capitalism, but African socialism in regards to talking about the idea of ujamaa or familyhood.
Right on. And was the Black News an extension of the?
We had Black News, our monthly news magazine, and from that, we actually, I got to say this, I was given an assignment. G2 was famous for giving people assignments. You know, the thing was, all right, brother or sister, this is something you got to do. And I'm like, what? He gave me the assignment of being the producer and host of a radio program. And back in the 70s, I became the producer and host of an East radio program on WLIB called A View from the East. When he gave me the assignment, I was like, brother, what are you talking about? The radio? I don't know anything about radio. I don't know any. He said, brother, that's your assignment. Today, it was mentioned, WBAI and the program I have, I've had that particular program, it'll be 23 years. So that's G2 and the assignment that he gave me. Yeah, I was the editor of Black News for a number of years. This brother Onaje was right there laboring with us at Black News. I mean, this brother here, as a poet, as a writer, somebody who, we have a great mutual respect for each other.
I just wanted to add, in terms of making the historical omissions, before the East, 1965, February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. And Leroy Jones, who became Amiri Baraka, left the Lower East Side, left the village, and he actually did a fundraiser at the Village Gate, March 28th, 1965, where he had people like John Coltrane, Sun Ra, James Spalding. This is the recording that came out of that, in fact. His way of dealing with Malcolm X's assassination was to create a cultural center in Harlem. And he did it on 130th Street, 108 West 130th Street. It was called the Black Arts Repertory Theater School. That particular record, as I said, came out of that. And the Black Arts Repertory Theater School, which was called the BARTS, functioned for about 6 months. But its impact lasted for much longer time as far as the effort that Amiri Baraka made, which was to bring the music out of the village and into the black community where it had roots. What he did, in fact, when he first started Bart's, was he would have people like Milford Graves, whose picture we see up here, going around, Albert Eiler, Don Eiler, playing on the streets of Harlem, playing very, very adventurous music. Sun Ra, playing on the streets of Harlem, 125th Street, with the music that they played. The significance of that is 2 years later, in 1967, when John Coltrane played, April 1967, in Harlem, it was his last concert. It was advertised as John Coltrane in Africa, And it was April 1967, he died July 1967, And he played there with Pharoah Sanders, Alice Coltrane, Jimmy Garrison, Rashid Ali, very adventurous music.
Yes, John.
And there were wall-to-wall black folks who were culturally aware, people in African garments who lined up, overflow crowd at Olatunji's to hear John Coltrane playing some of the most adventurous music of his lifetime. Just before he left the planet. So when people talk about this music not being accepted by the black community, I say I was a witness. I was there. I saw it. I heard the bullet cry, as they say. Like that. So that 1967 concert, all of that predated what people at the East did, which was to actually create an institution that lasted to bring the music into the community. And another point about the Olatunji concert, Olatunji, Yusef Lateef, and John Coltrane actually had created a a union where they were going, the concert that John Coltrane did April 1967 was the first of a series of concerts they were going to do. Yeah, unfortunately, John Coltrane died before that was realized, but that was the first in a series of concerts they were doing, which was about bringing the music out of the clubs and into the black community. It was realized by the East in 1969. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely there. And this is another example, I believe some records that were produced via the East for Sun Ra. Recordings that Pharaoh Sanders did over there. You want me to pass those out, Mr. Do you want me to pass those out? Okay, sir. All right.
These are my actual photos.
Lord.
We've had a number of different exhibits
And then
over
we'll
time.
pass them around. Norman Connors, yes, sir. Probably. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. You'll go around. And we will definitely come back to the East and New York Musicians Festival and Studio We. And Professor Greg Tate, who's been continuing those efforts, who I was always a long-time enthusiast of his writings and his articles in the Village Voice, and every Wednesday I used to look forward to his articles, especially countering some of the misinformation about Miles Davis's avant-garde music in general. But in reference to that dynamic and tying it in with the rest of the panel has said, how would you see that connection as an educator and a writer in the topics that you've written about yourself in that regard?
Pass the mic, right? Hip hop style. So, man, when you brought the topic of this conversation to me, I'll tell you the first two thoughts that occurred to me. And thank you for putting me on a panel with all these badass brothers who inspired and shaped my whole notion of what self-determination through the music could be, and through their art and their actions. But the first thought that came to mind was just how the battle cry of two organizations, two entities that were about organized resistance to white supremacy, the racism, the oppression of black folks, the Panthers, and the Black Arts Movement. Two of their battle cries, their two battle cries were, one was seize the time, and another was it's nation time, right? And I thought, well, what a great metaphor for what the music has always done. Essentially, if you're engaged with this music, that's what you've been about. It's like you've been about seizing time, you know what I mean? In that metaphorical, in that musicological sense, you've been about building the nation, through the call and response generated by the music. And then the second thought was just when I was, was just to think about people who I saw as avatars and exemplars of self-determination in the music. And the first name that came to mind was Alice Coltrane. Right, I said, who has extrapolated more of a self-determined life, from the music than Alice Coltrane? Coming from Detroit, developing in that incubator, and then through her work with John, and then her own music, you know what I mean. Whereas Butch Morris said to me, this is somebody who was an innovator on 3 instruments, in the music, and she extended that across time. If you think about, organ, harp, and piano, but then, through what she did with her vocal music, as she embraced her spiritual practice and turned her back on, the commercial venues for the music, and kind of built her own temple and created a choir, and then developed this whole body of her music that was about spiritualizing, in an African American sense, the Vedic chants, of her religion, But but of course you can't, when you think about Alice Coltrane, it's definitely within a lineage that Mary Lou Williams is certainly a part, of generating. And if and if you want to talk about people who developed, a body, who sustained the practice of self-determination across time, Mary Lou Williams starts out in the swing era. She's one of the, her apartment is where the bebop revolution was fomented, was developed, And then, one of the first interviews I did when I was at Howard University as a journalist was with Betty Carter. And so, Betty Carter, of course, just through her artistry represents, such a hard-won individual, form of artistic resistance, just in terms of, her sound. But she's also one of the first musicians, of her generation to have her own record company. You know what I mean? And we've also invoked the names, the AECM, and certainly I think about how three artists in particular who are friends, who are kind of sustaining the legacy of that organization on the global sphere. Nicole Mitchell, who was a president of the AECM. You got Martina Roberts, you know what I mean? And then you got Tamika Reed as well, you know what I mean? So I just wanted to, just forward those two, those two notions, because that's what, kind of jumped off in my mind from, yeah. But, but certainly, we want to talk about June Tyson's collaborations with Sun Ra. We want to talk about Diane McIntyre's collaborations with Cecil Taylor. You know what I mean? Expand the sweep, and the inclusion, of these bad sisters, Yeah.
And in reference to that, I did notice that there were no women on the panel, but was a coincidence. The focus was the Loft jazz activity and the cultural activity in the community, so that's just how everything formulated. But that was something that was a sticking point in my mind right from the very beginnings of the formation of this panel, and I thank Professor Tate for representing that without a doubt, because
Yeah. So, what I also wanted to talk about was just the Black Rock Coalition. You know what I mean? Yeah. You know what I mean? Because, founding members of that were Vernon Reed, Melvin Gibbs, who, before we even got to thinking about the coalition, they were telling me about coming up in Brooklyn and how formative the East was. You know what I mean? These are two cats that the first music they were invited in to participate in outside of the music they were playing in the clubs in Brooklyn, which at the time was a place where, Vernon told me, you played every kind of music. You played music that represented every culture and every community within the community. As you were presented with a gig, so reggae one night, somebody's R&B demo show the next, rah-rah, calypso, bop, you know what I mean? And that was Brooklyn was their incubator for learning, you know what I mean? They learned from masters of those styles who lived in the community, right? And, but, it was the harmonic music of Ornette Coleman, Ronald Shannon Jackson, James Blood Ulmer, that provided them with a bridge beyond Brooklyn to the, to the world, you know what I mean? So, but yeah, when we came together to form the Black Rock Coalition, we also were presented with this notion that black folks, weren't interested in rock and roll. You know what I mean? In fact, Vernon told me about being told, by, various entities, in the industry that, Negroes can't play rock and roll, right? And then from cats who were trying to make the crossover R&B move, it was told like, well, black people ain't interested in rock and roll. Now, what was interesting was because one of our first acts was to write a manifesto, statement of purpose, where we said, rock and roll is black music and we are its heirs, right? Well, what we found was that, we met like every Saturday for about 2 years at a Sister Linda Bryant's gallery in Soho. And if you really want a before and after picture of New York real estate, I'll just tell you that in 1985, when we formed, she had 2 floors of an abandoned manufacturing, a textile manufacturing plant between Prince and Broome on Broadway, right? And that was supported with New York State money, for the fascistas, Reagan's government kind of destroyed that. But we met every Saturday there, and what we found in those first 2 years was that we had more people who were attracted to us because of the manifesto than the idea that we were playing rock. And in fact, we had more. The organization was composed of more non-musicians than musicians, because this is before Living Color got the the Sony record deal, right? So Vernon had musicians just say to him straight up, "Well, that's great what you're doing, but man, I can't mess up my career by getting involved in that." And so the people who came into the organization, they actually learned what the history of and what the sound of black folks playing rock music was through coming to the first concerts we produced. So that's the thing. It's like black people are always attracted to the cry of freedom. If you're organizing around that ideal in our community, the people will come. Musicians, with commercial ambitions might lag behind. In fact, the community, in terms of pursuing the freedom principle,
Yes, sir. Mr. Sultan, in reference to that, because you spent a lot of time with Jimi Hendrix, and indeed you were on the part of the Woodstock performance where he reconstructed the Star Spangled Banner in the spirit of Albert Island and Sun Ra.
In the spirit of the cry.
Yes, sir.
So I'd just like to tag on to what he was saying, because basically the mainstream has it to where they say that they want to tell you that Elvis invented rock and roll, not telling you that the majority of music that he was playing anyway was composed and written by black musicians, and it was imitation. So if you look at the difference between creating and imitating, then you might have a genre. But the industry, as he said, black people, as he said, he mentioned Jimi Hendrix. I can give you an example that we did a concert in Harlem, and we did it on the streets because the mainstream radio would not play Jimi Hendrix there. They felt the same way. Frankie Crocker, all those people felt the same way that he reflected, that black people were not interested in Hendrix music because the majority of the people that listened to it, if they didn't see a picture of him, they thought he was white, because of rock and roll. But they don't know who invented rock and roll. They have no history, but he was able to move through all genres and all levels of people, and he was impacted, as we say, socially and every way that has been described across this table. And it was also tied into self-determination. He had a management that was taking advantage of him and kept him on the road and busy, and never gave him time to create, but and made him think he was broke all the time. I mean, there's a lot of stories I could go into, but that's another series. I have a series, a lecture series called From Hendrix to Loft Jazz, and you can look it up online. I'm just saying it's a portion, you know, but it's only a small segment. But what I want to say is that tagging on to what he's saying and what he's saying about the music, I want to tie that into self-determination. Abdullah would tell you, when we produce concerts, I couldn't care if you were a trio of female acapellas or jazz or whatever. And people called us, kind of thought we were prejudiced at that time. But we weren't prejudiced, we just knew the circumstances that we were living under, and we would not allow Europeans to take over, as the history has shown in the past, and we were determined at that time. And so the history is they come in, they learn what you do, and all of a sudden, it's no longer yours. And we live that to today. And so at that time, he was talking about Olatunji and Yusef Lateef and John Coltrane. Well, John had started his own label. There were so many areas of self-determination that were coming through, and that was on all areas of music. And music, I played across genre. I played with everybody. I played with all types of musicians in all types of situations. You know, our love is for what they call jazz. Well, my thing is Aboriginal music. It's like the music of the people anywhere in the world. That's why I have like the Aboriginal Music Society, because it's about embracing the cry of the people. It's similar to Malcolm, humanism, you know, humanity, man, and the music expressed. So it's all genres. Now, most people cannot play jazz because they don't study. They don't say all the keys or all of that. But you don't have to play jazz to transport a feeling to human beings, you know. But what has happened was that the mainstream, right now, you go out here, outside, listen to your radio, I would tell you 80% of it is created by machines because they don't put it on the air. Everything is construed and by a few people in control, and it's all about mind control. But I don't want to go off on a tangent on that. And they have mind control, and we have control to elevate and lift up the spirit of the people like we've been doing since we've been placed here hundreds of years ago.
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to address, again, that whole question of the community not getting Jimi Hendrix. So I just recently found out that according to the Billboard reporting of Hendrix's album sales, he was always in the top 10 of the R&B charts because those rankings, those pollings, at that time, they weren't just drawn from radio. They were drawn from all the mom and pop record stores around the country where folks used to buy their music. So every time Jimmy had an album come out, it went into the top 5, the top 10, based on those reportings from the community, not from corporate controlled media.
Yes, sir. And I was going to ask you to mention that too. You just did. Yeah, that leads into a lot of the independent recording and record labels that was happening. That was a development within the development, and everything that the spirits on this panel were just saying leads right into that. And Mr. Ahmed, because I know you and Steve Reed did independent recordings, and what was that thrust like when you were putting out? Sorry, there's some examples and stuff. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, actually, the Steve Reed recording Nova was done at Studio We, as was this recording, Sekaso Kojo Inkai, was done at Studio We around the same time, 1975, 1976, which comes back to the New York Musicians Festival and how that in 1972 launched a whole bunch of independent places where people could play because of what J.D. Parent talked about earlier. You know, the clubs were places where you had to play commercially. You had to play what the club owner wanted. You had to sell booze for the club owners. You couldn't play creative music, and so the musicians, the artists at the time, created venues where we could play creatively. And a lot of them sprang up after the New York Musicians Festival of 1972. Places like Studio Rivby, that was run by Sam Rivers and Beatrice Rivers. Places like Ali's Alley, that Rashid Ali built himself, which was one of the largest jazz clubs in New York City at the time. Yeah, the Ladies' Fort, which was right down the street from Studio Rivby. Environ, which is which was located at 500 Broadway. You go down there now and you see Bonwood Teller and foo-foo shishi places, as my wife would say, right? You can't even walk into those places unless you got some money, right? But these places, there was a place called the Brook, which was on 19th Street that Charles Tyler managed. So all of these places were places where, if they did not exist, I would not be here talking to you, because I wouldn't have a reputation that would allow me to be on this panel, right? So musicians actually were self-determined enough to create venues where we could play and actually develop a reputation. I was able to develop a reputation enough in playing at the Lofts so that Sun Ra, accepted me into his band in 1975. And the first place I played with Sun Ra was at the East in April of 1975. You see what I'm saying? So, so I was working on the Lower East Side at the Lofts, and I was working in Brooklyn at the East and places like that, because there was a parallel situation. Both of these places were about moving the people forward, whether you're working on the Lower East Side or you're working in Brooklyn at the East. Now, the interesting thing about the Loft movement is that around 1974, many people from BAG and the AACM came into New York. And that infusion of artistry really allowed for there to be more focus on what it was that we were doing in the Lofts. And by 1976, there was a recording made at Studio Rivby at Sam Rivers' place called the Wildflower Series. There were 5 recordings of some of the people in the movement who had never been recorded before. David Murray, you know him? Yeah, he was recorded then for the first time in 1976. My first recording was on the Wildflower Series. Hamid Blewett, Oliver Lake, Wadada Leo Smith. Yeah, all of us were basically being recorded because we were working at Sam Rivers' place, and because the AACM came and brought more attention, because it was an organized effort that came out of the Midwest, and they came into New York, and then people started paying attention to what was happening in New York. And so it was a very important period of time in this music that few people know about. It's a hidden history as far as this music is concerned. In fact, I was listening to Branford Marcellus on the air the other day, and he was talking about what was happening in the 1970s, and he knew absolutely nothing about the Loft movement, because New Orleans wasn't a place where people would know anything about the Loft movement. If you were from Chicago, you were from St. Louis, you were from Los Angeles, you were a New Yorker, you knew what was happening here. But if you came from some place where it was not publicized, you would not know anything about this whole movement that was going on, which was an incredible movement of self-determination. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead. So, JD, I wanted to ask you a question, because I read an interview with it was Oliver Lake, where he was saying that, he said when cats from BAG started going to Chicago, like the thing that impressed them the most was that the music that they, Lake said, the music they were playing in the basement, these guys were actually playing in front of people, and that's what really inspired them, in terms of bringing their endeavors or their sound, their music to the public. But I'd also like, just hear you talk about some of those multidisciplinary projects that that Cats put on, because I know they involve creators from all the disciplines.
Well, it's true. BAG actually is distinguished with being the organization of this time that had all of the arts represented. I said Emilio Cruz was in residence. He was there during the height of BAG, and he and Pat moved back up to Chicago, where she's from, a few years later. And then this Thurman Falk was a filmmaker. But our theater and our literary cadre of poets, like I mentioned before, Bruce, Sonny Bruce, Jule Rutland, Shirley LaFleur, Malinke, Robert Elliott, and Vincent Terrell, and among others, gave us work. They got us work. The dance department, that's what I'm trying to get to. We had a strong dance department, and so we used to get work. Now, what really was the catalyst for the beginning of the Black Artist Group is that some theater people BAG put on a performance of Genet's The Blacks. Julius Hemphill was the composer, always as aided by Bakita Carroll, and putting all the music together, and that took place at one of the schools, the universities, and it was the producers. It came out of a white production company, and we were all working together in a sense at that time. And so some stuff went down, and but it caused the Black Artist Group to actually form at that point. From the most important thing, of course, was the fact that we were doing a version of Genet's The Blacks. So this was a big thing. I did want to make a couple of comments on the Black Rock Coalition thing, but why would some black people have to tell people that they can play rock and roll? It's absurd. He did mention the Billboard magazine, but they only put blacks performers in soul and rhythm and blues. Do you realize there was a time that no black names went into rock and roll, not even Little Richard and James Brown and Chuck Berry? Nobody, right? True. Nobody was allowed, and they even set up the earliest big-time music video on TV, which was MTV, all white until Michael Jackson's Thriller. MTV was completely segregated on purpose, and to go along with this whole idea. So they really tried to just...
And they had to be held hostage to put Michael Jackson on.
Yeah, well, you probably know the whole story, but I just saw the phenomenon.
Just quickly, yeah.
Tell them, because I don't know
what
happened.
Yeah. It was like the president of Sony basically told MTV, if you don't play Michael Jackson, we're not going to give you any more videos. So they said, oh, okay, we'll play Michael Jackson.
Yeah, okay. It had to be something like that,
Incidentally, what's going around as physical examples are examples of independent recordings that people in the panel were on, just as examples, and just how they're constructed, very artistic and very different from the kind of assembly line mentality that happens with recordings at different times. So, and
know about this one in John Coltrane? This record, this particular record in John? Sir. Okay. So this is self-produced album, Don Pullen, Milford Graves. So the story I've heard is that John Coltrane ran into Pullen and Graves in the street, and as brilliant and worldly as he was, he had no idea that you could actually produce your own album, right, at that time. And he asked them to become his record label because he was so impressed with just the idea that, like, some black folks could produce an album on their own, independently.
I just wanted to, I was surprised there when Abdullah told me that he recorded those 2 albums at Studio We, because I forget a lot. I guess it may be my age, but it was recorded. I went back to '69, and in '69 I was with Jimi Hendrix, and after his passing, I came back into New York City. I was living upstate where I presently live, but I came back into New York City. But I have this emblem here. It's called the Aboriginal Music Society. And in 1969, Ali Abui and myself, after moving from the east side, we were upstate, and we started Aboriginal Music Ltd. To provide portable recordings for musicians on sites and also at different concerts. And what happened was that after, in the 70s, we moved to Studio We, but we still had the Aboriginal Music Ltd., where we would go out and we would provide the sound facilities, and we would do the recordings. And even past that, we through the years, we moved from, when we moved from Studio We moved to Cambridge Street in Brooklyn, and we just changed the name to Home Recording Studio. And we were recording even a wider range of calypso, soca. We were recording jazz, ska. We were recording jazz, everyone, rock and roll, rhythm and blues. And so I just wanted to tie that into part of the self-determination and part of the economics that he had mentioned, to have some finances to support yourself as a musician. And part of that was the Aboriginal Music Society early. And as he just mentioned, because when John Coltrane came out and was trying to start an early label, and we said, wow, that it is possible to do. And so we tried it, and a lot of fruit came from that. So that's, I was just trying to add another point of musicians and self-determination, and rather than going out and doing what we do, working construction and post office and all the rest of it, right?
I'm going to say something, and what happened, Ahmed started talking about Amiri Baraka and his importance in regards to the Black Arts Movement. In 1981, in preparation for a radio program, myself and 2 of my comrades were putting together for WBAI, we did a 16-hour radio program on John Coltrane. And in the program, we had a few interviews, we had live music. I had Brother Khalik Abdullah Raouf come and bring his group up to WBAI, and he played live. I also, we tried to focus on John Coltrane music that at that particular point, 1981, was really not that well known. And I was interviewing myself and my comrades. We went out to Rutgers, Newark to meet up with Amiri, and we met him, and he started talking about John Coltrane and was at that point working on a book about John Coltrane. And that particular book was to look at John Coltrane as a political, cultural, social phenomena. And we were talking about it, and well, one of my questions, of course, to him was, well, what's going on with the book? When is the book going to be published? And he said, of course, that there were no publishers who were interested in publishing it. Okay? So now that book never came to light. And that is indicative of the condition that we find ourselves in. In terms of attempting to try to control the narrative, I remember that there were a number of publications that used to talk about our music. Amiri had come up with the cricket. There was also Ron Welburn had the grackle. Now, we don't have too much of anything. And it's something, of course, that we have to address, because if we don't control the narrative, then we see what happens. Black folks have nothing to do with rock and roll. Black people will not come out and see this crazy music that people play, like Sun Ra and Ahmed and everybody up here. And we've had these discussions. We had a discussion at the Vision Festival the last time that I had an opportunity to work with Bob Amiri. And, Ahmed was there, Juma was there, I was there, Amiri was there. The last time that, we had an opportunity to really, work with him, be on a panel with him. And the discussion there was to be about, why don't black people come out to events like the Vision Festival? And, of course, the belief is among Europeans that we have no connection to that music. But of course, that's the kind of reality that we're forced to deal with if, in fact, we don't control the narrative. So one of the things we have to address very clearly, we have all these folks here, we have to be in the habit of telling our own history. It can't be a matter of some interested observer or some historian 50 years after goes ahead and talks about, well, this is what Ahmed Abdullah was doing. Ahmed Abdullah's here, he can do it. Juma's here, he can talk. JD is here, Greg can speak for himself. Ras has to do some more speaking in regards to this stuff. And of course, in terms of this 50th anniversary of the East, we are mobilizing folks to go ahead and tell that story. But it is critically important for us to begin to control the narrative, because if we don't, we know what will happen.
Quick, in reference to that, Mr. Basir, I noticed that these two Sun Ra records were produced by the East, and so you had an actual relationship. How often was that? And now,
the interesting thing is that there are a number of albums that were made at the East or around the East. Pharaoh at the East was not made at the East. It was made in a studio, a large studio, but people from the East were invited. So at the end, when you hear people like yelling and screaming, they wanted to try to create the environment, the atmosphere, but they didn't record it at the East. Mtume has an album, Al Kabulan.
I forgot that one.
All right. That was recorded at the East. These albums, in terms of Sun Ra, we had a very organic relationship with Sun Ra and the orchestra. So, they would just come to town and they would hang out. We would invite them whenever we could. We had this brother, Pharaoh Abdullah, and his two favorite musicians were Sun Ra and John Coltrane. So when they were coming, Abdullah would go ahead and, like, for instance, he would have a red carpet or something outside 10 Claver Place. And then when Sun Ra and the band would come in, he would, try to do all kinds of rituals or whatever as they came in. The same, of course, would be as far as Pharaoh went. He would do the same kind of thing. So in having this kind of organic relationship, it became Richard, who at the time was the brother who did Sun Ra's technical piece. We had talked about the idea of collaborating in regards to records and recordings, and these two recordings were out of that particular kind of collaboration. They were not recorded at the East, but in the same way that Pharaoh at the East was not recorded at the East, it was kind of like in terms of that same relationship. There is a 45 that is on an East label that was done by James Spaulding, if I remember correctly. All right, and that was one of the only real records that was done on an East label. But of course, our intention was to do something. Ras asked me, when we had the weekend sets, everything was recorded. But most of those recordings at this particular point, I can't say where they are. Okay? It's the result of a number of things that happened. But, one of the things, of course, is that we do not really value and understand the importance of documentation, archiving, recording. We don't understand the importance of that yet. Now, we can look back 50 years and say, oh, man, that first Leon Thomas concert at the East, man, it would be really good to have that. But, of course, as we always said, hindsight is 20/20.
So I just want to let you know, Amiri finished that manuscript on John Coltrane. because he mentioned it among the writings that he had that were not published, and I believe they were in the writings that Amiri and the family donated to, or had a transaction with Columbia University, provide there, and I'll if we stay in touch, I'll actually find out if those papers are available now, because we may be able to go in and actually read them.
And, I have that interview. I have that interview recorded. I've got that. And as a matter of fact, it was interesting because I saw Ravi Coltrane last night. He was over at the Jazz Standard. And I mentioned to him that I had interviewed his mother when he and Oran were really, really little. And this was something that I had played on our radio program, A View from the East program, back in probably about 1976, 1977. So, this year, probably for the next 2 years, I'm going to be really intent on archiving, on transferring, digitizing things, because there's just a lot of things that we have, and we've got to be really conscious in terms of how important a lot of this actually is.
Ras mentioned Sister's Place earlier, and some of you may know that I'm the music director at Sister's Place, and I've been the music director there for 20 years now. Sister's Place is actually an historic landmark institution after being at Jefferson Avenue in Nostrand for 23 years. Yeah, a connection between the East and Sister's Place is the Sister's Place is 2 blocks away from where the East was. 2 blocks away, yeah. The East 10 Claver Place, Sister's Place is now in Nostrand and Jefferson. Another connection is that the very first person, Leon Thomas, to perform at the East also was the very first person to perform at Sister's Place in 1995. 1969, 1995, Leon Thomas, yep. Another connection is the reason that I am the music director at Sister's Place is that while I was working on my unpublished manuscript around my memoirs of working with Sun Ra, I needed some help with it, and I called Amiri Baraka, and Amiri Baraka referred me to Luis Reyes Rivera. And Luis Reyes Rivera and I would work on the manuscript for Traveling the Spaceways, and Viola Plummer, who is the founder of Sister's Place, came and heard me play, because I would also play with Luis and his jazz oets. We would do Sunday afternoons there. She heard me play. And the original music director was Carlos Garnett. Carlos Garnett left after 2 years, and they were without a music director. And so I was asked to be the music director in 1998, just as I was leaving the Sun Ra Ensemble after Sun Ra's death, yep. So the Sister's Place has been the information, the knowledge that I have gotten from being a person who worked with Studio We as an artist, being a person who worked in the Loft movement as a performing artist, being a person who has worked around this music over the years. I was able to bring that information to my work as a music director, which I think has allowed it to develop over the years, because if you look at these places that we were talking about, most of these institutions, they've had a shelf life of about 5, 6, 7 years the most, except for organizations like the AACM, which has been around for, from 1960s, So information is key, because if you know something and you're sharing it with people, you can, get some longevity as far as this music is concerned. So the fortunate thing is that we've been able to exist because of the fact that it is not one person doing it. There's a whole organization behind Sister's Place. There are people who are politically active, socially aware. And the other thing is that I have a wife, Monique Ngozi and Reed, who's been supporting me for 20 years in doing that, because I couldn't do it on my own. Believe me, I couldn't be there on Saturday nights without somebody who's saying, Ahmed, you can do this on Saturday nights, right? So like that.
Yes.
I just wanted to add a quick thing on today. Coming from the archival standpoint, NYU is now home of the Julius Hemphill Archive. It should be announced in the fall. It's been put in there. Ursula Oppens, Marty Ehrlich has been the person who has gathered the first group that's going to open of stuff, and it's a thing that people are going to be able to access, and also continue to be able to study Julius's music, and which is so many of us. And another thing that's going to happen at NYU again in the fall, you look for it, is they're going to be a celebration of who is still alive, Howard Johnson, who appeared on so many performances and records, including Archie Shepp's Mama Too Tight, and so forth, and is been around, and so they're going to have a celebration there this fall. So those are two upcoming things that you can look for.
And go ahead, Mr. Sultan.
No, I'm fine.
I'm sorry. Okay. About the recordings that are going around under the name of Bag and Human Arts Ensemble, how did those recordings come to fruition? Because I know that you are on those yourself.
Well, Bobo co-produced those early records. Where are they? They're going around with Carol Lowenstein, and they. This was the early 70s, what can I say? I moved to New York and went back home for a while because I went to Africa in 73, and I was there through some of the middle 70s. But Julius produced his first two records there, which is the iconic Dogon A.D. The iconic Dogon A.D. record, along with the poem of Blind Lemon Jefferson,
Yes,
with K. Curtis Lyle, and I was very fortunate enough to live long enough to perform with K. Curtis Lyle in St. Louis 2 weekends ago at St. Louis University. So people were beginning at that time to try to get the technology to go, because guys in Chicago got to make some records early, but not St. Louis. That's another real big difference, is that between Chicago and St. Louis. It was people were pulling their hair out trying to figure out how to get a record out, where it was already happening, of course, with Del Mark, and it wasn't so much about independence at that time. Nobody had the technology independently to put out records. So being a much more music industrial city like Chicago, the people, they had an infrastructure and so forth, and so the records started coming out in the middle of the 60s. But we were still struggling in St. Louis in the beginning of the 70s. And Oliver really had to go to Paris and make his Bag in Paris record. And Julius started out with those two. So, the early 70s was really a struggle.
I'd like to go back to the topic of self-determination. Basically, we've been talking about what has been happening on the East Coast. I'm from the West Coast. And I was born there. I came here in probably 1965, around that era. But there's a lot of things that were happening across the country. There were just things happening in Los Angeles, San Francisco. Aside from, we were talking about the civil rights during the 60s. And so, even though the focus was here, because we were talking about Imam Baraka, he was taking truck and what do you call the flatbed? Mm-hmm. Well, I was in Oakland with him when he was doing performances there back in the 60s. I'm just saying that things were there. There were organizations in L.A., New York, that were about self-determination, and I'm not sure what's in existence now, but all the way from L.A. To around the same time, the BAG and the ACM started, but there were the spirit and the will for self-determination was represented by the people, and what has happened to me, and I see it, is that so many of us musicians lost our support during the civil rights struggle, because as far as I'm concerned, once we integrated, and we lost a support in the black community economically, because I remember when there were black stores in neighborhoods everywhere I went. There were laundromats. There were other things happening, and I think that the economic aspect has gone backwards, because I see right now, I live in a small community in Kingston, New York, right next to Woodstock, and I see the dollars come in there, and people are anxious to spend it. I mean, it's not like a lesson we can learn from other communities, from the Jewish to Chinese, where money flows 10 or 12 times, circulate in the community before it leaves the community. And so I personally have seen where we've surrendered our power, because now we're fighting for economic power, and we'll never get what we want, or the freedoms that we need here to exist in America without it. And so we were talking about recordings. I mean, I come back here, you guys could pick up one of my logos. It's Aboriginal Music Society was about providing our own business and independence, and I was happy to hear that we recorded you and many other greats, musicians who have come over the last 40 years and built their career. That's just about what it is. But I think that it's time with the young people that they're learning to sustain, some of the process.
Yeah, I was just about to.
we were probably gonna go to the same place, yeah. But I'm glad you mentioned West Coast, because of course we got to talk about Horace Tapscott, Pan African People's Orchestra, but also in terms of that, in terms of a continuity, Kamasi Washington and his whole cohort, all the guys that play with him, they actually met up in a music program in their high school that was led by a former member of the Pan African People's Orchestra. You know what I mean? So from 14 to now, those that group are in their early 30s. They've been playing together, right? And the thing is, what they did in terms of reigniting that spirit of collectivity is, per the AECM, they went out and created concert situations for themselves, like in whatever venues were available. So if there was a supper club that had a slow Sunday, they went in there and started performing. So, but one of the things they did as well was that, they recorded Kamasi's album, Ryan Porter's album, Miles Mosley's album, and I think there's a couple other musicians in the group whose names I'm forgetting, but they found a recording studio that was next to LAX. And they went in there for just, I think, 2 days. And everybody pooled their money collectively, and they just paid for everybody to record their full albums, with that studio time. So, keeping the self-determination funk alive. You know what I mean?
In reference to the Black Arts, the Black Rock Coalition, and recording and getting music out there, what did you see were the differences as far as the 80s were concerned, as contrasted with the earlier time period? Not that there's ever much difference, but what did you notice about the difference in reference to that effort?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things we did was really within about the first. Let me see. Formed in August '85. By December, we did our first kind of coming out party. It was called the Drop the Bomb party up at the space I mentioned, Jam. And then good brother, friend of ours, Bob Wisdom, was the music director at the Kitchen, right? And so he by that time we had generated a lot of press because of the political thrust of the organization. Even Rolling Stone, I think, gave us like 7 or 8 pages with pictures, and now they had just heard the music at our first kind of public event. We did 3 days at the space CBGB's, called Stalking Heads, where we presented, about 9 or 12 of our bands, right? And so we did this January. We did this concert called the Apartheid concert. Yeah. You know, with Sekou Sundiata and all. It was the first time we put together a big band. Then we did Stalking Heads. I think the Rolling Stone profile came out after that. And you know, I remember that because Vernon was the head of the organization. I remember his managers were complaining that all the press that they had about Vernon was about the coalition, but that actually, you know, in the end, that worked, you know, to his favor in terms of, you know, kind of moving out of or moving into that Sony contract. But the interesting thing about that was like the band got rejected by every label in the city twice. You know, the first time they were moved, Living Color. Yeah. The first time, you know, they sent their tape around every label. Everybody said no, you know. And then Vernon got asked to play on a Mick Jagger record. Jagger came down to CBGB, saw Living Color, and said, "Hey, you know, dig what you're doing. I want to produce a 3-song demo for you, so a 2-song demo for you." They got rejected again, but the guy who signed them to Epic was a guy named Mike Kaplan. He wanted to sign them before, and even with the Jagger, you know, imprimatur or what have you, know, endorsement. His boss said no, but then Mike really kind of pushed on it, and the guy was like, "Well, you can do this, but it's on you if it fails." Right? I mean, so there was this idea that just inherently failure is built into the idea of black folks playing rock music, right? You know, and of course, you know, I mean, subsequently, you know what I mean? They, you know, got the first album out, got on MTV, got Grammy nominations, blah, 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 you know what I mean? But it was all like an uphill struggle, you know what I mean? As it's always gonna be, you know. I won't even say, you know, it's an uphill struggle. It is the sacrifices and we always make in pursuit of controlling our own destiny, you know what I mean? And these things that were seen as detriments by, you know, other members of Vernon's generation, you know, actually turned out to be the things that actually made the difference in terms of, you know, kind of moving them into that national profile and getting the support of all the rock press and rock television that was available, you know, at the time.
There are a couple of self-determined efforts that I think that we overlooked. One is from the 1970s, the Collective Black Artists created by Reggie Workman and Jimmy Owens. They were the prime movers and shakers of that organization, and that had a relationship with the East. And in the 1980s, Lester Bowie, Oliver Lake, and Cecil Taylor created Moby, the Musicians of Brooklyn Initiative,
Right.
which was a very, very important group in that particular time. So I just didn't want to overlook those self-determined efforts. Yeah.
And we forgot Strata East.
And Strata East, which came out of the Collective Black Artists. In fact, Stanley Cowell and Charles Tolliver were the movers and shakers behind Strata East, and that certainly was a major independent label. That's right. Yep.
Okay. Now, basically, what we're talking about right now is a period between, I could probably say, 1966, a period of time, and 1986. I mean, we're talking about a period, one of the most undocumented period of so-called jazz history, and so to keep it on topic. I'd just like to say that we're talking about self-determination. So historically, I think we got to maybe think about prior to that period and some of the people's shoulders that we're standing on. Like the musician union in Harlem that the brothers started in around the 1900s, and how, I mean, there's a lot of history up here that we can talk about that inspired us to try to do what we're doing even to this day. So, and to presently, what are the young people doing in the music? Because it's, you know, I have a daughter in hip hop now, so I have to, you know, my But so I'm saying, so I would just like to see, you know, from the early to the present, if we could talk about that, because we have discussed some of the period that we experienced here. Most of us are at that age where we experienced of the 60s, you know, the loft jazz and the transition and all the hippie movement, and some of us even go back to the beatniks. So, yeah.
Yes. And a lot of the activity that's being spoken of now kind of counteracts, as I mentioned before, what kind of came along in the early 80s as far as what the black community could and couldn't understand as listeners. And that's not a new topic by any means, but in the fact that cutting edge music was present right in the neighborhood, what is the source of the misinformation regarding that, Mr. Ahmed? And then everybody can answer that.
Well, I think Basia pointed out that, you know, we don't control the narrative, you know, and if you don't control the narrative, you can't talk about what it is that we're doing, you know, and that needs to be the self-determined effort that exists today that I think is lacking. I mean, there are some self-determined efforts around the music, but we don't have people writing about it, publishing, you know, information about what is going on in our social structure, you know, around the arts that we are dealing with.
I mean, the thing is that there's a lot of musicology that's being done, music history that's being done around that period, the period erased by the, you know, what people call the jazz police or the gatekeepers, right? But it's, you know, it's in academia, so it's you know, there is documentation being done. I know that there's a scholar at Columbia University. Oh man, what's my brother's name? Brent Edwards. Yes, Brent. Yeah. I mean, well, I'm sure he's interviewed you about, you know, for this book he's working on. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, but I think because you know, life moves in a forward motion, so, you know, we can point to examples like Black Rock Coalition and then Kamasi Washington, you know, and his cohort, you know, who kind of sustained those principles, those ideas, those models of sustainability, you know, from earlier eras. I mean, I think, I know Jason Moran is actually working on a big project now about James Reese Europe and about the courageous moves he made to establish a black, you know, musicians union, you know, in that period of time. And I think Jason, you know, is all, you know, because he's been doing a deep dive into the archives, and, you know, one of the things he has come to believe is that, you know, Europe was assassinated. He wasn't just caught up, you know, in an argument with like an irate drummer, you know, who stabbed him. That there was some intention, some other intention behind that. That's a part of the story as well. So, you know, I mean, I think, you know, the thing is that people are definitely taking advantage of the internet, of YouTube, you know, I mean, to create, you know, these files, these documents, these programs, you know, around the spectrum of history, of our history that's been erased. So, you know, it's just a question of kind of pointing younger folks, you know, in that direction. You know, there's a lot of information that's available, and it's, you know, we just kind of have to kind of organize and filter it and use it in situations where, you know, we're able to project and promote, you know, what people would call alternative histories were actually you know, the actual histories, not the virtual, you know, of culture and music, you know, yeah, culture, politics, yeah.
Let me say this, and this is, you know, where we kind of jumped off in terms of Left Forum last spring, and that is, and this is, I think, something critical. a radical or revolutionary politics or vision requires a radical or revolutionary culture. And part of the problem that we have today is that as far as the white left goes, is that they don't see the necessity to engage in a revolutionary or radical culture, all right? And that is, very real in terms of the Left Forum, because, you look at all of these workshops and the content of all of these workshops, and nothing, for the most part, has anything to do with this music, with a radical or revolutionary culture, and that's one of the things that was attempted to try to be addressed at the Left Forum last spring. The thing is still true. We're talking about now in 2019 as far as politics and looking at somebody who's supposedly progressive or somebody who's, quote, liberal or somebody who's radical. And the thing right now is to make the connection between the politics and the culture. That's what had happened historically all along. All of the periods we talk about the 60s, from 65 on. If we can go back further, we can go back to the Garvey movement. We can go back to the Garvey movement and the connection between the Garvey movement and the Harlem Renaissance. All right? We come forward in time, and I think that part of the issue is that by the time we hit the mid-'80s, the political organizations ran into a whole bunch of issues. COINTELPRO, et cetera. Folks had been assassinated, jailed. Organizations had been destroyed. So at that particular point, the politics ran out of gas. And when the politics ran out of gas, so did the music and the culture as well. So now I guess the challenge is to try to reconnect the politics and the culture, the music, everything. We have to see how we can reconnect it. Because very clearly now, in 2019, we need a resurgence of a radical and revolutionary vision. People in terms of talking about, what's supposed to happen, in the current situation with Agent Orange in power, et cetera. We have to have a real radical or revolutionary vision. We can't just talk about, we want these folks' feet up off our necks or whatever else it is. It's got to be, well, what do we want? What do we see in terms of a vision? What do we see the world looking like? That's what's really important. And, people, I guess at this time, feel so downtrodden, they're just like, just give me some space, let me breathe. I'll be happy. Yeah. But that's not enough in terms of being happy. Yeah. So we have to see how we can go ahead and reconnect the politics and the culture, because ultimately that's where a clear, radical, revolutionary vision comes from, both in terms of the culture and the politics. Yeah. So they have to be connected. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that we've certainly seen from all the black, all the folks from grassroots communities across the country, particularly in terms of the monsoon of women who got elected, to the House this year. All of those, those women are speaking in a way that's frightening to like even their cohort in the old guard Democrats. You know what I mean? So they've actually brought that radicality, in a 21st century way through just using social media to advance their agenda, not even going through traditional press. And then there's just other initiatives you can look at that have begun to kind of turn the tide in terms of communities, in terms of people actually organizing around the country to deal with gang violence in the community. You know what I mean? And they have more to do with like the decrease, of that kind of activity in communities around the country than the police who want to take credit for it. But in fact, the information shows that, it's people actually reaching out to youth. It's creating situations within the community. So there's a radicality and a revolutionary imperative that's going on, in these localized contexts. I mean, what was powerful about the way the avatars of the '60s movement was they put culture in alignment with those, so the same folks who were involved with, like Panthers involved in trying to bring, folks out of a certain kind of despair or a certain kind of surrender to criminality against the community. We're also, the folks that were bringing the music into the communities. I mean, my parents, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, so the adults in that community formed something called the African American Cultural Center, in '69, and they brought folks like Pharaoh, to Dayton, you know what I mean? And I just think, there's a certain, there's an absence of a figure like, an Amir, a Baraka, or Larry Neal, Skia Muhammad Touré, the poets, who were certainly the ones that, kind of were the bridge between activism and the artists, and so there's absence there, but I think there's forward momentum going on that we should definitely acknowledge, in the communities. And one of the things that I've increasingly just started to think about is that there's this whole question around the old guard Democrats want to focus on Trump, but where the real action is for us is definitely on the ground in the communities where we live. You know what I mean? So it's going to be interesting to see how that split, plays out, because it may be that the Dems can't compete with the madness on that national level, but certainly in terms of our focus and our initiative and our energy is getting more Stacey Abrams and Ilhan Omar's and Ocasio-Cortez's into place where they can really start to, as they've already started to do, like retune the notion of what's a democratic, socialist, progressive agenda on that House level, and what the thing is, when I look at those figures in particular, they do represent like the culture as well as the politics, at the same time. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
I think one indication of the dearth of the union between the cultural, social, political, spiritual aspects that we were talking about from, I would say, 1964 on to now, is that my wife and I went to see this movie Babylon that was premiered here on Friday at BAM, and the two of the people who were involved in the production of the movie said that it had been banned from the United States for 40 years, but it's released now, which I thought was a significant thing to say, that it could be released in 2019, in this period of time. What is that saying about what people feel about where we are politically, socially, and culturally, and spiritually in the United States? Ras, can I say that maybe the people in the audience might want to, okay.
I was going to get right to that, Mr. Ahmed. And Babylon, I believe that has Brinsley Ford, who was in Aswad as the lead singer. They were a great band, side by side with Steel Pulse and Black Slate, Matumbi, and UK Roots, coming hard, And just a quick clarification, I use the early 80s sometimes as a reference point of as a time of reaction, and that's true. But there were, as the panel said, there were things that were continuing. We had Professor Tate and his writings in Black Rock Coalition, and then the music continued. But the reference I used was the impact on some of the false information about the level of understanding in the black community in reference to music that is supposedly, quote unquote, hard to understand. And the lights on this panel here were all progenitors of of that music, and there was a very good reception from what I remember in younger years, and so we're going to do our Q&A.
Let the people speak.
Right on.
I wanted to mention three things in terms of ownership. One, Gigi Grice Ahmed, and like talking about what happened to him in relationship to his self-determination in the music. Two, as we drive around the city, Ahmed is always pointing out to me the places where things happened. If you go to 10 Claver Place now, there is no indication that it was the East. I'm saying that we need to have black plaques, that we need to be putting the plaques on the buildings, because in terms of knowing our stories, this is one way that we would be able to reclaim our history and have our young people understand what happened in these spaces in previous times. The last thing is we developed a thesis on about naming our music. Calling it jazz, the music of the spirit, and it is inclusive in the sense that it has 4 or 5 male progenitors and female progenitors of the music, and defining their contribution to the music over time. So I don't know, Ahmedi, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. But I would just say thank you to Greg for being inclusive, because one of the other things that I think is a problem about the way that we describe our stories. Yes, we've lost our stories, but we've also lost the voices of the women inside of this. So I really think it's important that we try to, kind of bring us all out as we're doing this work.
So the two things, Gigi Grice, a very important person within the music. If you look at that 1958 picture that was done of a day in Harlem, you would see Gigi Grice on the left-hand side with a hat on and some manuscript paper under his hand. He had gone there with Thelonious Monk. Gigi Grice was very important. When Randy Weston did his recording called Uhuru Africa in the 1960s, he had talked to Randy Weston about the publishing of his music and making sure that it was published independently. And the story goes that people, the powers that be, overheard him talking about the fact that Randy Weston would have the nerve to publish his own music. And they said to Gigi Grice was that he would never work in this industry again. And Gigi Grice didn't work in the industry again. He actually became a school teacher, and his name, he changed his name, and but he changed his name to an Arabic name, and the school was named after him in the Bronx. So the same greatness that he did as a performing musician, he did as a music educator in the school system. Yeah. The other thing that Monique mentioned about the progenitors, over the course of time and being a sister's place, after about 6 or 7 years there, we were asked to take the music that we were doing at sister's place over to Europe, to Milan, in fact, and we became an umbrella of a person in Milan who was producing a concert series. So we decided if it was going to be exported, we need to name what we were doing in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Brooklyn so we could claim it. So we decided to call it Jazz and Music of the Spirit. And while Luis Reyes Rivera was alive, and Monique, and we got some other people like Salim Washington and Larry Redley, we worked on this thesis that we call Jazz and Music of the Spirit. And we named 8 progenitors, 4 women, 4 men. Now it's 5 of each of them. John Coltrane, Sun Ra, Duke Ellington, I'm missing some, Betty Carter, Nina Simone, Abby Lincoln, yeah, and Jackie McLean. Like, those are the people we decided if you want to know what this music is about, look at their documented work, and we would only put in people according to the contribution they made after they left the planet. And so the thesis is online. You can look it up, Jazz and Music of the Spirit, like that. Yep.
Yes.
me
Mr.
just-
Ahmed showed that to me once, and it's really great. You know, his writings on there. Yeah.
Let me
There's
talk-
also a mic. Sorry,
Yeah.
Mr. Bassir. There's mics going around
Going
for
around.
the Q&A. Yeah. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Mr. Bassir.
No, yeah. Let me just address the whole issue in terms of a plaque at 10 Claver Place. I mean, that's something that we've talked about. But let's even backtrack a little further. What we've been attempting to do now is to have Claver Place from Fulton to Putnam co-named G2AUC. Now, we have put this before. We have gone to the community board where it has been approved. Right now, the local electeds are somewhat fearful of bringing this forward as the issue of, quote, black anti-Semitism reverberates around at different times in different places. The latest, of course, is, we've got, Sister Omar, dealing with this thing in terms of making statements which only make common sense. And then, we get all of this, pushback. Now, the issue in terms of G2, I don't know if everybody knows this particular story, but going back to Ocean Hill, Brownsville, he was on WBAI with Julius Lester. And what happened was a student in Ocean Hill, Brownsville had written a poem. Yeah, Sia Beerhand is her name. And the poem was there. And Julius had told G2 to read the poem on WBAI. And G2 said, well, are you crazy? I'm not going to read this poem because there's a line in there that people may have some issues with. And Julius was adamant, no, you got to go ahead and read this poem. You got to go ahead. So he read this poem, and one of the lines said, hey, Jew boy, with your yarmulke on your head, hey, Jew boy, I wish you were dead. And then it goes on in terms of talking about the struggle in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, what happened, and Sia expressing herself in this particular way. Since that time, G2 has been branded as being an anti-Semite. This has happened. As a matter of fact, if you look back in history, he was working closely with the Dinkins administration in the lead up to David Dinkins being elected mayor. He thought that there would be a position available for him within the administration, and because of the anti-Semitism piece, he was denied that position. Okay? So now, 50 years later, it's still there. These folks continue to raise it, and now the black local electeds are afraid to go ahead and bring it forward in this particular environment right now. So, we'll keep everybody, appraised of what's going to happen, and this is just something that happens. We've got certain communities that have a pull, they have sway over folks in a way that just does not make any sense. And that's where the situation stands right now.
All right, you got a... I think you were next. Yeah.
You mentioned the collective black artists. I was part of the collective black artists with Jimmy, Reggie, and Kobe Narita, and Paul Ash. And today, there is a hunger for music that inspires the human spirit. That doesn't exist. And my brother is an important musician here in the city in the Latin jazz tradition. He has a doctorate that he earned at Manhattan School of Music. And he's been the director for the most famous Puerto Rican singer. He's been making, for about 25 years, so he's making money for people that have no connection to the community. And he's looking for an alternative. I'm a construction worker. And this past Wednesday, people say that God works in mysterious ways. I call this radio program about this guy who is a lover of the music, acoustical music, spiritual music. So he said that I called him, and because he knows about money, and he knows where the money is, and our communities need those things. So there are exciting possibilities available to us through creative approaches connected with the music. I'm a construction worker. There's a huge need in the community for construction housing issue that addresses the housing needs of the artistic community. And so I would like to speak to one or two of you concerning the economics and putting together a creative approach to take advantage of the fact that there's a hunger in the community, in the black community, the Latin community, and other communities for music that is spiritual again. My brother said to me about 3 years ago that he wanted to quit music because music is being put out by people who do electronics. And so I just want to be able to speak to one of you concerning exciting possibilities that exist with the community.
Okay. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay. Answer him? Oh, I thought he was.
No.
I'd just like to deal with your question. I remember, you know, the coalition with Kobe, Narita, and all the people, because what has happened, it was a consortium, and what it was everyone, all of the organizations, including the East, basically we were all working together under consortium. So what you're talking about right now, I'm sure that you can discuss with some of the people here about the community, because we have talked about jazz. Well, I appreciate the music, but there's so many categories. That's why I go back to the Aboriginal, because people here, okay, the spiritual, you talk about the spiritual aspect. If you started playing Cuban spiritual music or any other kind of spiritual music, it's a taboo in this country, just like it was when we came here and they put on the drums. I'm just saying that people, but it sparks in the community. But it runs through all the different veins of all the different areas, as far as I'm concerned, with the mixture of the various musics that's being presented now. You know, so what you know, we can talk. If you say you're in construction and you have a facility, that is or not, you may not have the facility, but how do you reach the community? You say the black, the Latino, and you have to include everybody now, and that's what we did with the New York musician and all cultures. So I don't know if you're coming from the Bronx. You know, there's people that are systemic in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and New York, but it's all multicultural. So I'm sure any of the brothers here will be more than happy to talk to you about coming together in some unity.
And if I may say, if you come out to Sisters Place on any Saturday night, you will hear spiritual music. That's why we call it music of the spirit. It's about a symbiotic relationship that happens between the people on the stage and the people in the audience. It's something that we inherited from the East. That's what you would get when you went to the East. You would hear, you would come out feeling powerful, feeling that you could conquer the world because of the spiritual force that was in the air in that particular environment. Yep.
Go ahead, man.
Hi guys. I just got here at 5. I might have missed it, but I was wondering, in realms of understanding the scene in the 70s, Jolie Wilson's anything about Jolie Wilson as part of the scene. And I only met him once. I took a workshop with him once. So just trying to understand more of his, any thoughts about Jolie Wilson from that time?
Well, Jolie Wilson, if I'm not mistaken, was basically from Oklahoma, and but he came here, and I believe he came here via of California. And when he came here, him and Monty Waters and I can't say Ronnie Boykin, but there was a whole cadre. Dewey Redman. There was a whole bunch of folks that came out of the San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury area, and when he came here, he was as a singer. In fact, I was on a couple of records with him and Archie Shepp, and but there's not a whole lot that I could share. I know that he was, you know, bicycle enthusiast aside from being a musician, because he was telling me he was going to ride his bicycle to Oklahoma one of the last times I talked to him. But the ladies for it, he opened, and he eventually turned it over to Hakeem Jameen, you know, when he decided to move on. But he opened the ladies for it after Sam Rivers opened Studio Rivby, as another alternative, because during that time there weren't really enough places for the musicians to have an outlet, and so people were opening up. One of the strange, I won't go to, you said Jolie Wilson. I got a lot of stories, sir, excuse me. Okay. As you know, he passed away in Europe, so, that's about it.
I can say Jolie Wilson performed at the East. As a matter of fact, he is one of the vocalists on the Al Cabelon album, along with people like Andy Bay. So, we're very familiar with Jolie Wilson and appreciate his work.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Noble.
Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. There's a real two ironies about the whole BAI thing. One is that Julius Lester converted to Judaism. And the other thing, no one likes to talk about this at BAI now because it's all hunky-dory, right? But that Christmas, when they had that Christmas coup, and I knew a white, he was in the Green Party. He said, this is all racist. This is just, that's all that was going on with this. And then a friend of mine who was, I'll put it this way. I was at a function, and there was a person at BAI, white radical, had a show, he had a show. And he didn't realize I was near him, and he remarked something and says, well, BAI is basically now just a black station. So, but the thing with the whole anti-Semitism thing, this is not my main point, right? But black people, we allow this to go. We do not tell the Democrats, says, look, we can tank any presidential candidate you set up there. We control the presidency. White people haven't voted for a Democrat since Lyndon Johnson, quiet as it's kept, right? So, you set up Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton, and you're gonna talk about Farrakhan, a woman in Congress. I mean, how many countries has Farrakhan destroyed compared to those two, right? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people dead, right? Children, because it was worth it, right? But we don't do anything, we're like pulling the punches. My thing though is with this current panel, which is a little disturbing, is you're talking about integration and self-determination. Okay, where are we having this conversation now? This is not an Afro-American neighborhood. It's not an Afro-American space, right? I don't want to, what it is, is what it is. I heard about this stuff with Amiri Baraka's papers. I'm kind of disheartened. Same thing with Jews Hempel. They're going to Columbia and NYU, two of the three biggest landlords in New York City, the biggest gentrifiers going. And self-determination. I had a big falling out with another white radical. He writes about black radicalism, and we had a mutual friend. He died. I said, get the brother's stuff in the Schomburg. He was like, why? I said, don't you understand the Schomburg? The Schomburg. He didn't realize it was that important, right? Because let me tell you, having worked and been around these schools, black people are never going to get to that stuff. I really hate to just be blunt about it, but most black people are just not going to get access to those materials. That's a really, that's a really serious problem. I'm just basically saying that more than the narrative needs to be controlled. Okay.
Now, in reference to that, Mr. Perrin, there's been a lot of material coming out about BAG and the Black Artists Group. In that regard, there seems to be that legacy is being continued. There's
There's film out these days and things that you can watch on YouTube. Yeah. Okay, and as far as, again, this person that just spoke,
Noble. Noble.
Hey, Noble. Good. Because
hey,
people.
How you doing?
Yeah, all fun. I'm JD. And but I hear what you're saying about what it would be if black people will be able to, you predicting that they won't go to NYU and Columbia to do these things, to access these papers. Well, you could be right, and I don't know how much access people have in Schoenberg myself, in the Schoenberg, but certainly that is I mean, Sonny Rollins stuff just went there. You know, and I'm not sure what in any particular institution, whether it's a university or Schoenberg, they choose what they want to go in a lot of times, and things are but I'm not trying to accuse Schoenberg of anything, but I personally don't know what they want to accept or what they will accept. Columbia and NYU are doing these people. So I don't think it will be a thing where black people will not be able to go there, but it could be a situation that they won't go there, as you say. I won't deny that.
Well, yeah, I'm just kind of because you know when you have these elite schools, right? And this is what they are. These are elite schools, right? How are people even going to know that they're there? They're not really going to like tell you. Is it going to be open access where you can just like get online? And you know, to be honest, you know, I mean, Columbia. I mean, I know some black professors. And some of their their husbands are black, you know, professors. They have trouble getting into the library. They got to show ID to the library. You know, the white boy Bob Spy says, "Hey, yeah, oh God," and there's a black guy. You know, I mean, you know, there's this problem here.
Yeah. Well, the thing,
you know,
I mean, I'll just say because I know so many folks who are professors, you know, black professors at Columbia. There's also the group IRAS, you know, that Organization of African American Students. They do programs every month. There's also the Jazz Studies program that was established by two professors who are not in music, but in fact in the English department, Farrah Jasmine Griffin, Bob O'Mealy, you know, and that organization that they've had has been, you know, has been producing programs monthly, like for the last 10 years, I think.
Okay,
you know
I don't want to get into like what,
I'll just say this, but
listen,
I just want to
listen.
say,
you know, listen. Yeah. I know I've been to some of this. I know how what really, you know. I don't really want to get into public issues about what really goes on with some of this.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, but you know, I'm just bringing this up because this is an issue. You know, no matter what these folks do, and there is this hostility. You know, with when it comes to us in these you know, like these spaces, and I'll just say, you know, I'll tell you what these professors are not doing. You know, Harold Cruz once told me a story about Du Bois. You know, good old elitist Du Bois. How he used to go to like black churches. He would pull out a candy bar. He would say, you know, what is this? And everybody said, oh, you know, the good doctor's getting senile. So what's he doing? We know it's a Mars candy bar. He would unwrap that candy bar, and before he was done, you knew the workers, how much they earned, who owned the banks that were investing, the companies, which country they come in. Now you talk to these guys, he says, well, you know, I was on CNN last night, and that's the way they are. That's, you know, I'm sorry.
I'd like to address you because, see, I'm in agreement with you in terms of the universities. I can tell you by personal experience, if you go to the Rare Books Library at Columbia, I have pieces there. 400 pieces, because personally, after 40 years, I couldn't haul those boxes around anymore. After the eviction, I'm a working musician. I'm hand to mouth still to today. I'm almost 77 years old, and I seen collections. You talk about Imamu Baraka. I'm sure that his wife and his family couldn't handle it. I want to give you an experience. 20 years ago, I offered it to Schaumburg. It was not important to them. Then I offered to Jackie McLean's institution. I have thousands of collections of tapes that still are on. I just applied for a Grammy to copy some more. But I'm just trying to tell you that you wonder about things. He was talking about Brent Edwards. He found a student that 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, what was the name of the book? Great book. He just produced, Brent, his last book at Columbia. But it takes a student, and I don't think that the universities, as you said, serve the black community. I'm in agreement. I'm there. If we had this forum, it would be great to have it in the community but and there are activities in the various communities that are not really advertised, but people are spreading information. And I agree with you that a forum like this and the history and not only the past, the present, but we look at the future is incremental. Now, I can justify myself for donating material to those institutions because, number one, I could personally no longer preserve it. You know.
All right, we're gonna go on to another next question too.
Okay.
Yeah. So go ahead, bro.
So what I've noticed at my school is that there's something in my neighborhood with a lot of kids, and there's a lot of hatred in my school. Like this kid once said that he raped someone, and it's just been bothering me ever since. And I just wanted to see what you guys would have to say for those kids who are like being encouraged by bad things that they've seen on the street. And like a lot of kids curse at my school, and I would really like it to stop. So I'd like for you to tell me your advice for why they're doing this.
I could speak on that just a little bit because I have an 18-year-old daughter, and her name on site is Hustala, and I'm serious. But the language that they're using now there is because we have been indoctrinated to use that language, to think that it's it's a way of we've been indoctrinated over the last 50 years or maybe 40 years, because I remember back in the time when you said so-called bad words, people would correct you. Now it's normal, and to me it's part of, I can't use big words for a young man, but I have my grandson 9, you know, and I'm just saying that it's part of the process, and it's part of the dumbing down of the community. It's part of the dumbing down here, and you got the other aspects that think it's culturally fine to use all type of derogatory terms and flip it to just like words that they use for endearment. You know, I remember when I was coming along in the 60s, they said, "Oh, you're my dog," right? Now, who wants to be somebody's dog? But a dog was enduring. And so the language that they're using is people using it, to be honest with you, in my opinion, is just more to poison your mind. And what can we do about it? We can just only control ourselves, and because we don't have control over other individuals.
What school do you go to? 163. Where is that at? In Manhattan or Brooklyn? In Manhattan. Okay. Here's the thing. I would say, is this your mother? Yeah. The parents need to have more say so in what's going on in the school. You change your school by having more parental involvement. Yeah. The problem with schools is that parents sometimes don't show up. There's a parent-teacher conference coming up this week. Parents have to go to the school and really make a difference as far as the leader of the school is concerned, you know, who is the principal of the school. Everything in a school really filters down from who the leader of the school is. So the leader of the school has to be able to really change the whole environment of the school. It's a very difficult thing to do because children obviously are influenced by all of the things that are going on in our cultural and social awareness. And so, but the principal can make a difference. And if the parents are willing to make a difference, then the school can be changed. It has to be changed from the top down, though, and then changed by the students who are in the school. We do a thing in our school. I'm a teacher. I work as a music educator at PS3 in Brooklyn, and we have a thing called the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the 7 Habits of Leadership, and we have incorporated that in the school over the last 5 years. It's changed somewhat, yeah? But children are still influenced by the things they see on television, by the things excuse me? Absolutely, absolutely. But there can be a significant difference made by the leader of the school, is what I'm saying, and by the leader of the school incorporating a program that can change the culture of the school. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Just a couple of questions, and also to slightly address the young man's concern here. In terms of archive, which I think is really important, how much of the stuff that you are doing now, holding on to, or giving to, is being archived on the net? Because the whilst, yeah, there is a lot of misinformation on the net, there is also, a great tool in terms of making sure that everybody is able to access and go into those places that maybe are not designed for people of color to walk through the doors easily,
Okay, if you're addressing me, the problem. Okay, well, my personal problem to what you said is economics. If you realize that I have a reel of tapes with 40 minutes of music on each side, that's real time, and it costs so much to transfer that to an archival quality. So as you say, I have 1,500 tapes that I would like to transfer. It takes time, and it takes money. And so I found out through my 50 years of holding on to materials that I started recording in 1960 and doing, I have film, I have, what you're looking at here are part of my archives. I'm saying it takes financing. So for us to go back to an institution, I think I told you before, I tried just to save it by giving it to a black institution. Rutgers, they weren't interested. I'm telling you, I shopped around, because the gentleman who was an archivist who helped me for 10 years, he's a doctorate now. He wrote the Loft jazz book, Michael Heller, dealing with the archives. But we tried so many different areas. So what you're saying is a wonderful idea, but I can't even pay somebody to keep my schedule. Do you understand? Let alone transfer all these archives. Now, to be honest with you, I realized like last year, I said, do you know that you have, just in your process and what you transfer and what you already archive, you got close to $1 million, and that's why my family's suffering. Because I take from my kids' mouth and put it into projects as I go along. I get a grant from the National Endowment, I don't take a salary. I put my time in, plus my own money, on and on and on. And so, to me, I made some progressive steps, and all I need is, as they say in the carpentry, but for the sake of the nil, and the nil would be the dollar, and I can complete projects.
Like our very condition in this country means we've become like the masters of compartmentalizing contradiction. We do it every day, But I also believe that, when Malcolm X said by any means necessary, he meant you utilize whatever's at your disposal, to advance, whatever area you're working in. You know what I mean? So yeah, for families of somebody like Baraka, who have this material, want to see it preserved, want to see it rendered into technology where it is accessible to future scholars, and are also themselves reckoning with the loss of the income maker of that family, have this valuable material. Yeah, Columbia is the option. And the interesting thing about Baraka's papers is that for a long time he had promised them to Howard University, with the understanding that any of his kids who wanted to go there, could go for free, and that actually benefited at least 2 or 3, of his kids. So, that's all part of the swirling matrix of this question of what becomes of black legacy, right? But I also want to say too, there's the reason that these institutions are interested in that material is because of the transformative effect of black justice movement on the world. right? So it's that material has moved from being, and those figures have moved from being the pariahs of those institutions to the people who are really determining what the pedagogical future of those institutions are going to be as well. You know what I mean? Like what is going to be the story that's told about how America moved from, Jim Crow era to a Black Power era, right? And who led that march? You know what I mean? And like I said, I mean, the thing is, time ain't waiting for no one, and there's nothing mutually exclusive about, Black folks kind of organizing to create the kind of institutions that have the technology and the wherewithal to do these things, and people making other choices, from the embattled, the struggling economic context, with which, as Brother Juma was talking about, the people who are holding these legacies are working with. You know what I mean? So, I guess I know.
Yeah, go ahead, bro. Yeah.
I suppose what I'm saying is, in terms of the same legacy that came out of the 60s, you talk about 65, 68, the sort of Black Panther, East, whatever, where the culture and the progression happened, and it happened on a very local level, is still happening now. And, I mean, I have to rely on my kids to do stuff on my phone and etc. and otherwise, and to document stuff for me, or to at least allow me access to documenting that stuff for free myself. In London, we have a group called For the Man Them, which is a group of 250 black male creatives, most of whom are very young. There are sort of 10 of us who are over, over 50 something. And, but it is about that engagement on that level across the generations that allows us to archive that stuff, and also allows us to follow the example of, Soul of a Nation type, producing papers, producing cartoon things, producing films, where we help each other. And then those guys help to archive some of the stuff that we've done before, so that films like Babylon, which is when I was growing up, in terms of me being in companies with younger people, I now make it my process to make sure that they don't reinvent the wheel, because we spent a lot of time as a black community reinventing the wheel, rather than saying, when my kid first came to me and said, "Oh, I found this guy Jimi Hendrix," and I said, "Yeah, but look through those albums," which are things my kids don't engage with, because they've moved on a long way. They thought they were sort of decoration, and you have to, ancient history. So you have to go back, and actually they help me now to look at other stuff. And there are the people there. So I suppose what I'm saying is, what is the amount of involvement in making sure that this generation has a link to this generation? Yeah.
Community. Here in America, what you're talking about is community. And to this day, I am still involved in the community. Now, I'm not in New York City, but I'm in upstate New York. And the answer for that, as far as I see, being a great-grandfather, in terms of relating and passing on the legacy, we missed about 2 generations here in America. That's what I feel. From then, I think that we missed about 2 generations. I was talking to the young men in the sound booth, and what you're saying about their abilities for the information and to distribute it is excellent. But when you get to the point, one, who's going to pay them, and how are you going to survive while you do it? Okay, it's sustain yourself. And those are just 2 important factors, And so right now, I have certain productions that are geared for the money, and then I have to do something like Bandcamp and try to stream and to get the music out. Not necessarily because I know that I will never, or over the years, I was offered a contract negatively 50 years ago, to be plugged into the mainstream. And since then, I've turned different contracts down because of what they entail. That particular contract, I was with Hendrix and the Gypsy Sons and Rainbows, and the manager was trying to streamline the band from 6 pieces down to 3. And in that contract, in those days, it was a lot of money. And they said, but you can't play with Jimmy, and Jimmy had another thing, which was about self-determination. It was called Heavens Research Unlimited. And what it was about talent development. And everyone says he owned the studio down in on the Lower East Side on 8th Street, and he personally told me, he said, listen, that's Mike Jeffries, his manager. I don't own the studio, that's his studio. I just pay for it, That's basically what it is because of all the undertones in the music industry. So I'm saying that what you're talking about was something that people were talking about way back in those days on passing it on from generation to generation. And so how do we obtain it today? I'm going to say that it's being obtained and it's being done in small increments. So if we could get it to the point where, say, I could ask him. He's probably got a plethora of material from different periods in his closet or somewhere in a box. I know 20 people from James Du Bois that got a closet full of material that should be scanned, archived, blah, blah, blah. I can't even get through my own. So I'm saying, how do we get it to the generation? I'm with you and the gentleman here about the universities, from Columbia to NYU to Berkeley, and how their mass money to buy property, and what they do. As I was telling him, who knows? They may take this and never have a student work on what they have. And 50 years from now, they still have control, but it still doesn't get out to the public. So,
let me say this. Based upon what we're talking about today, it's obvious that there needs to be a larger discussion, and we're not going to resolve this issue in terms of archiving right now. So I think that one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to organize a discussion around this issue because it is one that is pressing, especially as we get older. I can tell you tales of major artists. Like, for instance, you see the mural in the East photos. There was a brother who did that work. His name was Jim Seitu Dyson. When he met an unfortunate demise, his family put his artwork in a dumpster. Okay? One example of a horrible story. So as we get older, the issue is that this is something that has to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed collectively, not individually. So we're going to have a discussion, a large discussion in which we talk about what are we going to do with all of this stuff that we accumulated. My wife will tell you about stuff that I accumulate. Our families will go ahead and talk about all the stuff that we have, and it's like, what are you going to do with all this stuff? And then, I got to say this, right? My wife will go in my space and clean up, and there'll be something that I need to find that I haven't found in years or whatever else it is, But that's just the reality. So it's something that we have to address, and we have to address it collectively, because it's a major issue. Yeah, that's the mural.
Yeah.
That's the mural, yeah.
Now, I can speak to one example of people who were part of 60s movements who actually have organized within academia, because my sister was part of SNCC, and so through her I've learned about the SNCC Legacy Project, which involves a number of those folks who were activists, part of the Freedom Riders and so forth, and now they've all, as they've gotten older into their 60s and 70s, matriculated into work in academia. So they've organized within academia to compile, oral narratives, oral histories, materials, his archival materials, from their cohort, their comrades, you know, and to make that, I've actually forgotten which is one of the southern universities that they've used to kind of accumulate and organize their efforts, you know. But I mean, that's the kind of thing. It'll take people who are invested in those histories, like these folks here, you know, and being provided with institutional support, you know what I mean, where there's a conversation going on between the people who were soldiers in that movement, the current community, and then the institutions that have the technological wherewithal to actually take on all this material. Because, you know, it's clearly we're talking about, you know, space, the kind of space you saw at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know what I mean? Where it just goes on for miles. You know, because we are productive. You know, or we produce history. You know, we produce culture. That's what we do. You know what I mean? We're just coming to a place where even in our own community, we're recognizing the value and the virtue of having archives, of having, you know, places that contain things that are not necessarily on the docket of traditional, even a Schomburg. You know, it's not necessarily thinking about these kind of materials as being as worthy as more literary kind of materials, right? You know, the sonic histories, you know, have it as much value, you know what I mean, as the written ones, yeah.
We're going to take one last question before we, which is hard to do because everything coming from the audience and the panel is the embodiment of the topic of this discussion, which makes it very fruitful. And I'm glad that people spoke out about what's going on in general.
I mean, last year, I got a call from Lois Elaine Griffiths, who's been working with New Eurekan Poets Cafe since the get-go, and then eventually got kicked out because got male-dominated by some of the guys there. And she was starting to have, she invited me up to Columbia with this discussion about the SDS and the student riots and all of that. And she was participant with the Barnard Black student movement at Columbia. But the majority, you know, because this guy, professor, wrote a book about the SDS and how active they were and blah, blah, blah. It was funny to see the senior citizens in the audience crying about, and they're all lawyers and professionals, crying about how the SDS failed and why the black students kicked them out of the president's office and in order for them to get their affirmative action going. So, I mean, these little actions that started then is why we, you know, sort of secretly kept our archives going, I think, in certain respect. So in certain respect, finding a collector for archives is very different. Her approach was getting Pratt Institute involved. She was able to find a Hispanic intern willing to work for nothing, and I tried the same conduit, and I get this intern, you got money? I can't have, I mean, you know, I couldn't afford her. And then she's like saying, well, I'm going to do my own music. And I just had to tell her, well, if you need some jazz musicians, I can help you. But that was it.
Okay. So the next conversation will be about archiving. That will be a very important component of and collectivity. Jazz and self-determination on the next one. And right on. And thank you. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it because I get to sit and have a conversation with people who inspired me directly through their efforts and everything. And that's not a cliche by any means. That is the truth, and I'm appreciative of this panel and glad that they came because I'm long-time admirers of all of them, and to the contributions of everyone in the audience. And thank you for coming. My name is Ras Moshe Burnett, tenor saxophone, soprano, student of the people on the panel. And there's going to be a series of classes commencing the subsequent Mondays after today called Jazz and Self-Determination. It's a free class. It's so I get to showcase what I learned from the people here on the panel, and in the future we'll have come and speak as well. And be sure to stay acquainted with the People's Forum, www.peoplesforum.org, and they have a whole series of cultural activity. There was some cultural activity and films, music, screening, workshops, classes, and be sure to stay abreast of what's happening. And thanks to the People's Forum for facilitating this conversation. And there's more ahead. June 1st is Jazz and Self-Determination again. More info about that coming up. And the conversations will spread, not just here at the People's Forum, but in the community, in all the various communities where African people are, regardless of what the street sign says, because this is all of our neighborhood, right? Right. So take care of yourselves. Thank you very much.